Okay. This is Miss Rolfe and Mrs. Shumate modeling for you how an A Socratic seminar answer looks. Move that. I'm going to move that mask. All right. Good morning. Sorry, I'm not doing a newscast. I am going to edit this. Okay. So, I would like to ask a question. Describe the writing style of this book. Is it formal? Is it informal? Spare? Complex? How does it handle dialect and dialogue? The distinctive ways that people Bea interacted with spoke. Are there sentences and paragraphs that are simple or complicated? Consider why Bea wrote the book the way he did and why he wrote it in first person. Would anyone like to answer that question?
I would love to answer that
Great,
question.
Whitney.
So one of the things that I feel like is significant to the book is that it is written in first person, because the different points of view that an author can choose from create either a closeness or a distance from the reader as far as how much access you have to their internal feelings and emotions and perspectives. And so I think it is important that he chose first person because it is all about understanding his own conflict and journey from being manipulated and brainwashed as a young child to recovering and regaining the sense of humanity, which I think from a distance it's harder to see. And we see his internal dialogue that I think is really important to help us understand that. So one of the things that I thought would be a good example of why first person is significant, it's on page 95 when he and his friends are looking for the possibility that his family's alive, and then they find this whole village on fire. And it's this really devastating moment that from a distance you could still see, if a third person narrator was like, he is crying, you see that and it's sad, but when you're inside the feelings of the devastated person, it's more powerful. So the quote that I think represents that is on 95, like I said. My entire body went into shock. Only my eyes moved, slowly opening and closing. I tried to shake my legs to get my blood flowing, but I fell to the ground, holding my face. On the ground, I felt as if my eyes were growing too big for their sockets. I could feel them expanding and the pain released from my body from the shock. And then it goes on to describe how I screamed at the top of my lungs, began to cry as loudly as I could, punching and kicking with all of my might into the weak walls that continued to burn, lost my sense of touch. So all of these sensations that he's feeling in shock and grief that we wouldn't have had access to if it were a different point of view.
Interesting. So, sorry. I also answered that question, and I answered it a little bit differently. But I do love how you pointed out the imagery and how that's like really present for the reader because it's told in first person. One of the things that I think Bea does that's also interesting in the story is that he stays true to his roots. His culture is very immersed in storytelling, and that's something that he grew up with. And I think that's present in the book, and it gives the reader a sense of place. And you're hearing it from his perspective, but he does, as far as like the dialect goes and the people he encounters, he stays very true to their culture so that we can see the vibrancy of the storytelling and the culture. And one of the examples, and he also uses it to add in another layer of meaning onto the situations. For example, when they're in the village and they're having that feast and they have this like moment of like happiness in the midst of the chaos, Musa tells the story of Bra Spider. And on page 75, as he's telling the end of the story, he says, the feast had ended everywhere. Bra Spider remained hungry, and because he was pulled so tight for so long, this explains why spiders have a thin waistline. So this story is actually a story about how Bra Spider was so greedy that he wanted to go to all the different feasts at once, and he gets pulled apart. I think that this story is a moment of lightness in the memoir, but I also think he includes it to show the greed of the rebels and maybe even perhaps the government, that people's greediness sort of ripped the country apart or ripped them apart. And I think that Bea very expertly layers that into this moment to be like, hey, I want you to pay attention. I'm putting this like kind of story in here to let you know that like greed is an issue in this culture. And I thought that was really interesting.
I really like that you brought that up too, because something that I think is also significant about that choice to include the importance and the central nature of storytelling in the culture is that he really is intentional about highlighting the humanity of all of the different people groups, because the whole book is hinged upon this idea of how do we keep hold of ourselves and our what makes us human and good. And I think culture is a huge part of that.
That is a good insight, and I hadn't really thought about that. But he does put the storytelling and the culture in there to humanize these people, for sure. All right, thank you. A+. That's an A+.